Mark Peterson was known around Riverview as the kind of man everyone could rely on. A soft-spoken technician with grease-stained hands and tired eyes, he spent his days repairing household appliances and helping neighbors with small electrical jobs. He wasn't rich or ambitious, but he took pride in his work and in his small, happy family. Mark had been married to Laura for 8 years, and together they had 2 children, Emma and Jack. Their home sat on a quiet suburban street lined with maple trees and neat lawns, the kind of place where everyone waved and smiled but never asked too many questions. From the outside, the Petersons looked perfect. Laura was cheerful and social, always attending school events and posting pictures online, family breakfasts, movie nights, and vacations by the lake. She called Mark her rock, a man who worked hard to give his family everything they needed. But lately, Mark had begun to notice cracks forming in the image he'd built. Laura's smiles were shorter, her laughter quieter. She spent more time on her phone, often turning the screen away when he entered the room. The warmth in her eyes seemed to fade, replaced by an indifference that frightened him. Mark tried to convince himself it was normal. Marriage had its rough patches, he thought. He blamed money problems and stress. His technician job barely covered the bills, and he often picked up night shifts to keep up with rent and the kids' school fees. But the longer he tried to explain it away, the more obvious it became that something was wrong. Laura had started dressing differently, wearing perfume she hadn't used in years. She began going out with friends, but refused to say who they were. When Mark asked, she brushed him off with a tired smile and said she just needed space. One night, while repairing Laura's old laptop, Mark stumbled upon something that made his heart freeze. The device wouldn't turn on, so he removed the hard drive to check for faults. In the process, he found a hidden folder buried deep in the system. Curiosity got the better of him. Inside were photos and messages, hundreds of them, between Laura and a man named Ryan Hale. Some pictures were innocent, but most were not. They showed moments Mark had never been part of, secret trips, intimate dinners, and handwritten notes calling Ryan the real love of her life. Mark sat frozen, scrolling through message after message, each one twisting the knife deeper. But then came the words that broke him completely. Laura confessed to Ryan that both Emma and Jack were his children. She said she had planned to tell Mark for years but never found the courage. Mark stared at the screen in disbelief, his breathing shallow. Every image of his family, their birthdays, their laughter, their hugs, suddenly turned into lies. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat in the dark living room, staring at old family photos on the wall, trying to recognize the man who had believed so deeply in something that never existed. The life he had built, the family he had loved, it all began to dissolve into something unrecognizable. For the next few days, Mark moved through life as though trapped in a fog. He went to work, fixed broken appliances, smiled politely at customers, but nothing felt real anymore. His hands worked on autopilot while his mind replayed the words from Laura's messages over and over. The betrayal ran deeper than anything he could imagine. It wasn't just an affair. It was the theft of his very identity as a father. Every moment with Emma and Jack now felt like a painful reminder of what he'd lost. At night, Mark sat alone in his workshop, staring at the tools neatly lined up on the shelves. He had always believed that everything could be repaired if you were patient enough. A broken wire, a damaged circuit. There was always a solution. But this was something no tool could fix. Still, part of him refused to believe the messages. Maybe Laura had lied to the man to keep him attached. Maybe the kids really were his. That faint hope was the only thing keeping him from breaking completely. One afternoon, while picking Emma up from school, he stopped by a clinic and collected 2 DNA test kits. He told Laura it was part of a routine check related to a family health study. She barely looked up from her phone when he explained. That indifference stung more than any argument ever could. Within a week, the results arrived. Mark sat at the kitchen table, staring at the envelope for hours before tearing it open. The words inside were simple but devastating. Neither child shared his DNA. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He just sat there in silence, the sound of the clock ticking louder with each passing second. Every piece of his life had been built on a lie. The woman he loved had deceived him for years, raising another man's children under his roof. The world outside continued as normal. Cars passed, birds sang, children played in the street. But for Mark, everything had stopped. In the following days, his behavior changed in subtle but unsettling ways. He spoke less, avoided eye contact, and barely ate. Laura noticed but assumed it was work stress. Mark started tracking her movements, checking her messages, noting the times she left and returned. The more he observed, the more disgust grew inside him. It wasn't just anger at her, it was anger at himself for not seeing it sooner, for being the fool everyone must have pitied behind closed doors. At work, his co-workers began whispering about how he looked different. His face seemed hollow, his hands shook even when he wasn't tired, and he often stared into space. He no longer laughed or joined in casual talk. At night, he filled notebooks with his thoughts, pages filled with scribbles, lists, and fragments of plans. His writing shifted from confusion to obsession, from hurt to vengeance. By the end of the month, Mark wasn't the same man Riverview had known. The quiet technician who once fixed broken things now felt consumed by the one thing he could never repair, his own heart. Sunday morning arrived bright and peaceful, the kind of day that usually brought laughter and noise into the Peterson home. The sun filtered through the kitchen curtains, and the smell of pancakes filled the air. Friends came over for brunch, chatting about work, the weather, and weekend plans. To everyone watching, Mark seemed perfectly normal. He smiled, made small jokes, and poured coffee as though life was ordinary. But deep inside, his mind had already crossed a line he could never return from. The quiet fury that had been building, inside him for weeks, had turned into a dark, fixed decision. For days he had rehearsed every moment in his head, how he would do it, when it would happen, and what he would tell himself to feel justified. There was no rush, no panic. He wanted it to look ordinary, like any other day, so no one would suspect what was coming. Laura moved around the house, laughing with friends and tending to the kids, unaware that her husband's calmness was only the silence before a storm. That night, after everyone had left, the children went to bed. Laura showered, humming softly, and climbed into bed with her phone in hand, scrolling through messages. Mark sat alone in the garage, pretending to sort through his tools. His thoughts were heavy and silent. On the workbench in front of him lay a wrench, a familiar object, one he had used countless times to fix broken appliances. It was solid, heavy, and cold. He stared at it for a long time, his reflection flickering in the metal. He walked back inside slowly, each step deliberate. The house was dark except for the dim light from the bedroom. Laura was lying on her side, facing away from him. For a moment, he just stood there, watching her breathe. Memories flashed before his eyes. Their wedding day, the birth of the children, the laughter that once filled the house. For a brief second, he wanted to turn back, but then he remembered the messages, the photos, and the test results that had stripped him of everything he believed in. Something inside him broke. His grip tightened around the wrench. The room filled with the sound of his own ragged breathing. The moment came and went like a blur. It was fast, brutal, and irreversible. When silence finally returned, Laura lay, still, and the only sound left was the faint ticking of the clock on the nightstand. Mark stood over her, staring at what he had done. The reality of it didn't hit him right away. His hands trembled, but his face showed no emotion. He sat down on the floor beside the bed, his body numb. Minutes turned into hours as he watched the light from the window shift across the room. There were no tears, no anger left, only emptiness. By dawn, he knew his life was over. The man who once fixed other people's problems had destroyed everything that had ever mattered to him. And as the morning sun crept into the room, Mark Peterson understood that nothing in the world could ever make him whole again. The hours after the act were a blur. Mark moved like a machine, methodical and detached, as if some other force was guiding his body. He wrapped Laura's body in a white bedsheet and tied it tightly with electrical cords from his workshop. The fabric soaked through with red almost immediately, but he didn't stop to look. His face was blank, his eyes dull, his breathing steady. Every movement was careful, quiet, almost practiced. He lifted her into the trunk of his car, his muscles trembling from exhaustion, but his mind stayed eerily calm. The streets outside were empty as he drove, the early morning fog curling low across the road. The familiar neighborhoods passed by in silence, houses where people were still asleep, unaware that a man among them carried a terrible secret in the back of his car. He didn't know exactly where he was going until he saw the old construction site on the outskirts of Riverview. It had been abandoned for years, half-finished buildings standing like ghosts under the rising sun. Mark parked behind a rusted fence and stepped out, the cold air hitting his face. He found a shallow pit where the ground had been dug for a foundation. Without hesitation, he began to move the gravel and wood aside, his hands blistering, his breath heavy. When the hole seemed deep enough, he lowered Laura in and covered her with dirt, broken planks, and loose concrete chunks. He didn't say a word. When it was done, he stood there staring at the disturbed earth, his mind blank. He got back into his car and drove home as the sky turned gold with morning light. Inside the house, the children were still asleep. Mark showered, scrubbed his hands, and washed the blood from under his nails until the water ran clear. He cleaned the bedroom, changed the sheets, and wiped every surface with disinfectant. He gathered her phone, purse, and keys and hid them in his workshop behind a loose wall panel. Then, as if slipping back into his old life, he made breakfast for Emma and Jack. He smiled, packed their lunches, and drove them to school, pretending nothing had changed. For the next 2 days, he lived as though Laura were still alive. He texted from her phone, replying to messages from her friends and family, saying she had gone to visit a friend out of town. He even posted a picture from her camera roll to her social media account to keep up appearances. It almost worked. But soon, her sister grew suspicious when Laura missed a family gathering without any warning. The police were contacted, and a missing person report was filed. When detectives visited the house, Mark greeted them politely and answered every question with calm precision. He said Laura had been distant lately, that she had left after an argument. His calmness impressed them at first, but small inconsistencies crept into his story. When they traced Laura's phone signal, it led them not to another town, but to his own workshop. Behind the wall panel, they found her phone still powered on, a blood-stained cloth, and her wedding ring. Within hours, the illusion Mark had built collapsed. Police surrounded the house, and he was led out in handcuffs as curious neighbors stood on their lawns whispering. The quiet man from Riverview had finally revealed the darkness he'd been hiding all along. When the police brought Mark into custody, he didn't resist. He sat in the interrogation room with his head lowered, his hands still trembling slightly, though his face was eerily calm. The detectives who questioned him expected denial, excuses, or tears, but Mark gave them none. When they asked where Laura was, he simply said, "At the construction site." His voice was flat, stripped of emotion. The officers exchanged uneasy looks before rushing to the location he mentioned. Hours later, they confirmed what everyone feared. They had found her body buried beneath gravel and debris, wrapped in the same bedsheet that had once covered their bed. The news of Laura's murder spread through Riverview like wildfire. Neighbors who had once admired the Peterson family were stunned. Some refused to believe it at first, remembering the cheerful couple and their 2 smiling children. But as the truth unfolded, sympathy gave way to horror. Reporters crowded the quiet suburban street, their cameras flashing as police carried boxes of evidence from the Peterson home. The same white picket fence that had once symbolized peace and stability became a grim reminder of what had happened behind closed doors. During his trial, Mark remained silent for most of the proceedings. He listened as prosecutors described his actions in chilling detail, showing photos of the crime scene and reading excerpts from his notebooks filled with dark thoughts and obsessive ramblings. The defense argued temporary insanity, claiming that Mark's discovery of the affair and the DNA results had pushed him past the point of rational thought. But the jury saw it differently. They believed he had planned the act, calculating every step, from hiding the body to faking text messages. The deliberation was brief. He was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In his final statement, Mark spoke only a few words. He said he had lost everything the moment he learned the truth, and that what he did wasn't out of rage but a desperate need to end the lie. The courtroom sat in silence. Even the judge seemed unsettled by his cold sincerity. After his sentencing, the children were placed under the care of Laura's parents. They were too young to understand the depth of what had happened, but they would grow up with the weight of it shadowing their lives. The house where it all occurred remained empty for months before eventually being sold. Yet none of the new families who moved in ever stayed long. Locals whispered that lights flickered in the garage late at night, or that faint noises echoed from the walls. Signs, they said, of something that could never rest. Years passed, and the name Mark Peterson became a grim symbol in true crime discussions and documentaries, a story of quiet deceit, hidden rage, and the destruction of an ordinary life. The people of Riverview tried to move on, but the tragedy left a permanent scar. In the end, Mark's story served as a haunting reminder that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones who once smiled the warmest.